In the summer of 1981, there was no louder voice in Calhoun County, Iowa than Gary Prentiss. Not the loudest voice at the county fair, though he was that too. Not the loudest voice at the co-op on Saturday mornings, though he filled that room like a radio turned too high. Gary Prentiss was the loudest voice in the county because he owned the only John Deere dealership between Rockwell City and Fort Dodge, and in 1981, John Deere didn't just sell tractors, it sold an identity. And Gary sold both with the kind of enthusiasm that made you feel like you were missing something if you walked out without signing a finance paper. Prentiss Implement sat on the north edge of Rockwell City on a lot big enough to park 20 tractors with room left over for the service bays and the parts department and the small showroom where Gary kept his newest machines polished under fluorescent lights like art in a museum. The 4640, the 4840, the iron horses, the future of American agriculture according to every brochure Gary handed out, and Gary handed out a lot of brochures. He was 44 years old that summer, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, going gray at the temples, with a handshake that was just slightly too firm, the kind that says I'm in charge here before a word is spoken. He'd bought the dealership from his father in 1972 and doubled its revenue in 9 years by understanding one simple truth about farm country. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Farmers buy from the man they respect. And respect in farm country was won on the land, at the auction, at the pull track, and at the co-op counter where everyone could hear what you said and remember it forever. Gary had cultivated his reputation the way a good farmer cultivates his ground, carefully, deliberately, year after year. He sponsored the county 4-H show. He bought the grand champion steer at the fair every August, always paying more than the market, always making sure the check was written in front of people. He entered his dealership tractors in the county fair pull every July and won 3 times in 5 years. He sat on the Farm Bureau Board, the County Extension Advisory Committee, and the Rockwell City Chamber of Commerce. By 1981, Gary Prentiss wasn't just a tractor dealer, he was an institution. Which is why what happened on the second Saturday of July, in the equipment staging area behind the Calhoun County Fairgrounds, mattered so much. Not just to Gary, not just to the man he humiliated, to every farmer in that county who'd ever been told that what they had wasn't good enough. Now let me tell you about the tractor. The Allis-Chalmers WD-45 was introduced in 1953 and built through 1957. It produced 43 horsepower from a 4-cylinder engine that Allis-Chalmers had designed for one purpose: to work. Not to be impressive on a spec sheet, not to win a magazine comparison test, to start on cold mornings, pull in any gear, and run 10,000 hours without complaint. The WD-45 was the last great tractor Allis-Chalmers built before the company began its long, slow decline. It was also one of the best balanced field machines ever made in America, light enough to avoid compacting wet soil, geared low enough to pull heavy loads at walking pace, and simple enough that a farmer with a decent set of wrenches could maintain one indefinitely. By 1981, a used WD-45 in running condition could be bought at auction for anywhere between $400 and $800, depending on the hour meter and the condition of the tin work. Most farmers who owned them had owned them for 20 years. The machine was invisible to Gary Prentiss. It was not on his lot. It was not in his brochures. It was not part of his future. The WD-45 that showed up at the Calhoun County Fair on the second Saturday of July 1981 belonged to a man named Delbert Moes. Let me tell you about Delbert, because without understanding Delbert, none of what followed makes sense. Delbert Moes was 61 years old and had farmed the same 240 acres in the northeast corner of Calhoun County since 1951, the year he turned 31 and paid off the last of his father's estate debts and finally called the land his own. He was not a man who made himself known. He didn't sit on boards. He didn't show up at co-op meetings unless the co-op had something he actually needed. He didn't sponsor anything or buy Grand Champion steers or shake hands too firmly. He farmed. That was it. That was all. In 30 years of farming that 240 acres, Delbert had owned exactly 3 tractors. An old Farmall M his father had left him, a John Deere B he'd bought used in 1958 and sold in 1964, and the WD-45 which he'd bought from a retiring neighbor named Leonard Kuschel in 1966 for $600 cash and had been running ever since. 15 years with one tractor. Not because Delbert couldn't afford another one, though he was careful with money the way men are careful with money who grew up watching the Depression take everything their parents built. Because the WD-45 worked. It started every morning. It pulled every load. It did not break in the middle of a field in October when the rain was coming. Delbert knew this tractor the way a musician knows his instrument. He knew the sound of the engine at the right temperature versus the sound of an engine running slightly warm. He knew how the clutch pedal felt when the plates were good and how it felt when they were beginning to wear. He knew the particular vibration through the steering wheel that meant the front left tire was losing pressure. He maintained it the way it deserved to be maintained. Oil every 50 hours without exception. Grease fittings every Monday morning before the week's work started. He'd rebuilt the carburetor twice, replaced the water pump once, and had the valve seats reground in 1974 when the compression began to feel soft. The engine had never been out of the tractor. It had never needed to come out. By 1981, Delbert's WD-45 had 9,200 hours on the meter. In a world where many farmers traded tractors at 3,000 hours, a tractor at 9,200 was supposed to be scrap. In Gary Prentiss's world, a tractor at 9,200 hours was a sales opportunity the moment a farmer finally admitted that his old machine was finished and came through the showroom door. Gary had made that pitch to Delbert twice. Once in 1975, once in 1978. Both times Delbert had listened politely, looked at the brochures, asked 1 or 2 questions, and gone home to his WD-45. Gary had dismissed him. Some farmers, he told his service manager, just aren't ready. You can't help a man who won't help himself. What Gary didn't understand, what he had never taken the time to find out, was that Delbert wasn't unready. Delbert was unconvinced. There's a difference, and it matters. The county fair tractor pull had been running in Calhoun County since 1963. By 1981, it was the most attended event of the 4-day fair, drawing crowds from 3 counties on pull night. The format was standard: weight classes, the progressive resistance sled, farthest pull wins. The unlimited class ran last, after dark, when the grandstand was full and the carnival lights were going and the smell of diesel and popcorn mixed in the July air. Gary had entered the unlimited class every year since 1974. He'd won 4 times. He'd entered a 44-30 in 74 and 75, a 44-40 in 77 and 79. This year, 1981, he was entering the brand-new John Deere 4850, which had just arrived on his lot the previous month. The 4850 was the most powerful row-crop tractor Deere had ever built, 902 horsepower from a turbocharged and intercooled diesel, weighing in at 18,400 pounds with the wheel weights Gary had added for the pull. The sticker price was $58,000. Gary had parked it in the staging area Thursday morning with a banner that read "Prentiss Implement, the 4850, Iowa's strongest." He'd stood next to it all afternoon, shaking hands, handing out cards, letting people sit in the cab. He was already booked for 3 test drives the following week. The pull was Saturday night. The entry list went up Friday morning. 31 names in 8 classes. At the bottom of the unlimited class list, added in pencil at 7:45 Thursday evening, were 2 words: Delbert Moes, and next to his name, in the equipment column, 2 more words: Allis WD-45. Gary didn't see the entry list until Friday at noon. He'd been in the showroom all morning with a couple from Pomeroy who were serious about the 4440 and needed 3 hours and 2 cups of coffee before they were ready to sign. When his service manager, a careful young man named Terry Haas, mentioned the WD-45 on the entry list, Gary looked at him to see if it was a joke. It was not a joke. Gary walked to the staging area himself because he needed to see it with his own eyes. The WD-45 was parked at the south end of the line, tucked between a 1976 Case 1070 and an International 1486. It was painted orange, which is to say it was painted Allis-Chalmers orange, the distinctive Persian orange that the company had used since the 1920s and that looks nothing like any other color a tractor has ever been. The paint was faded. The tin work had the small dents and scratches of a machine that had been worked, not stored. The exhaust pipe had a wire screen welded over the top to keep debris out during field work. There was nothing on the tractor that had not been there when Leonard Kuschel sold it to Delbert in 1966. Gary looked at it for a long time. Then Delbert walked up from the food stands carrying a paper cup of coffee and wearing the same thing he always wore, work pants, a gray shirt with a small tear at the left pocket, a seed corn cap with a bent brim. He saw Gary looking at his tractor and stopped. "Gary," he said. "Delbert." Gary turned to face him. "You entering the unlimited class?" "I am." "With this?" "Yes." Gary looked at the WD-45 again, at the faded paint, at the worn seat, at the hour meter that read 9,247. He'd seen that number before, in used equipment assessments he'd done for trade-in purposes, and the number meant one thing: done, finished, time to retire. "Delbert." Gary kept his voice friendly. He was always friendly. "I don't want to embarrass you." "Then don't," Delbert said. "I mean it. That machine," he nodded at the WD-45, "is 28 years old. It makes what, 43 horsepower? My 4850 makes 19.2. That's not a competition. That's a demonstration." "Then demonstrate," Delbert said. Gary looked at him. Something in Delbert's tone was different from the 2 times he'd come to the showroom. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't nervous. It was the tone of a man who has already made his calculations and is waiting for the world to catch up. "Fine," Gary said. The friendliness was thinning at the edges. "I'll tell you what. Since you're determined to embarrass yourself, let's at least make it interesting. I'll bet you $10,000, cash, that my 4850 finishes the pull before your WD-45 hooks up. That your tractor can't match my distance. That this isn't even close." He said the last part loud. He always said things loud. There were maybe 60 people in the staging area at that moment, and every one of them heard it. Delbert sipped his coffee. "Define the bet," he said. Gary blinked. He hadn't expected a negotiation. "I pull farther than you, I win. You pull farther, you win. $10,000. Delbert finished his coffee. He crumpled the cup, put it in his shirt pocket the way careful men do when there's no trash can nearby. "All right," he said. He extended his hand. "But I want the bet adjusted. You pull farther, you win. I pull farther, I win. And if I pull farther by even 1 foot, 1 single foot, you announce it over the PA system, in front of this crowd, that your $58,000 tractor lost to a 600 Allis-Chalmers." Gary laughed. The crowd laughed with him. "Deal," Gary said. They shook hands. 60 people witnessed it. By Saturday noon, the whole county knew. Here is what Gary Prentiss did not know about Delbert Moes, the WD-45, or the pull track at the Calhoun County Fair. He didn't know that Delbert had been studying tractor pulls for 3 years. Not competing, studying. He'd stood at the fence at 6 different county fairs in 2 different states and watched, really watched, the way tractors loaded up, the way tires behaved as the sled resistance increased, the way gear selection affected the machine's ability to sustain force over distance. He'd taken notes in a small spiral notebook that he kept in the glove box of his truck. He'd talked to an old Allis-Chalmers mechanic named Hugo Bauer in Humboldt who'd worked on WD-45s for 30 years and understood the machine's torque curve the way a doctor understands a patient's heartbeat. Hugo had told Delbert 2 things that nobody else had told him. First, the WD-45's torque peak was at 1400 RPM, not at the rated 1650. Below that peak, the engine built force faster than it lost speed. A driver who understood this could keep the engine in its sweet spot through the entire pull, holding the load at the exact point where the engine multiplied torque most efficiently. Second, the pull track at the Calhoun County Fair had a particular surface condition in the evening. The afternoon heat dried the top quarter-inch into a crust, but the material below stayed cooler and slightly moist. A tire that broke through the crust had better grip than a tire that rode on top of it. The breakthrough point depended on the weight pressing on the tire. Delbert had gone home from his conversation with Hugo Bauer and done something that nobody at the fair would have expected. He'd calculated tire loading, not guessed, calculated. He knew the WD-45 weighed 5,200 pounds in stock configuration. He knew his rear tires were size 13.6 by 38, giving a contact patch of approximately 220 square inches when properly inflated. He knew the force required to break through the dried surface crust at the Calhoun track. He'd gone there in April, walked the track surface, and pressed a soil probe into the ground at different depths. The number he needed was 24 pounds per square inch of contact patch. At 5,200 pounds, divided across the 4 contact patches, the WD-45 was putting 17 pounds per square inch on the rear tires. Not enough. The tires would ride on the crust, so Delbert added weight. He filled the rear tires with calcium chloride solution, 1,600 pounds total. He fabricated 4 steel brackets from half-inch plate and bolted them inside the rear axle housings, where they wouldn't be visible from outside. Another 180 pounds. He sourced 4 cast iron wheel weights from an old Massey Ferguson that a neighbor was scrapping. They bolted directly to the WD-45's rear rims with only minor modification. Another 320 pounds. Total added weight, 2,100 pounds. New total weight, 7,300 pounds. Tire loading at 7,300 pounds, 25.3 pounds per square inch, just enough to break through the crust and reach the moist soil beneath. He'd run the tractor in his back field for 2 evenings, pulling a loaded wagon through a section of ground he'd deliberately dried and then let develop the same surface crust. The tires broke through at exactly the weight he'd calculated. The grip was solid, no slippage. The third thing Delbert knew, and this was the thing that Gary would never have thought to check, was the 4850's gear ratios in the pull configuration. Gary was going to pull in a mid-range gear. Everybody did. Mid-range gave you speed and momentum, let the machine build velocity before the sled got heavy. But momentum-based pulling had a weakness. Once the sled's progressive weight transfer exceeded the tractor's sustained drawbar pull, the machine slowed, the tires spun, and the pull ended. The WD-45 in first gear moved at 1.8 miles per hour. At 1.8 miles per hour, with the engine at 1,400 RPM, the gear reduction produced a drawbar pull that Delbert had measured with a scale in his own field. 6,200 pounds of sustained force at the hook. The 4850, by Delbert's estimation, would produce somewhere between 14,000 and 16,000 pounds of peak drawbar force. But peak force in a pull isn't the number that matters. Sustained force, the force the machine can maintain as the sled gets heavier, is what wins. And the 4850's power shift transmission, which Gary had bought partly for its convenience, shifted automatically under load in ways that reduced the gear ratio at exactly the wrong moment. Delbert had watched 2 4850s at other fairs that summer. Both had made impressive starts. Both had slowed in the same way, at approximately 180 feet, when the automatic transmission logic responded to the engine load by shifting up instead of holding. A shift up at 180 feet meant less torque to the ground at the moment the sled needed it most. Delbert's WD-45 had no automatic transmission. It had no computer. It had no logic except the logic of a gear ratio and a governor and a man who knew where the torque peak was. He pulled in first gear. He held 1,400 RPM. He let the machine work. The grandstand was full by 7. Not the usual crowd. The usual crowd was 1,800 on a good pull night. This was 2,400. with another 300 standing along the fence where standing room didn't officially exist. People had driven in from Rockwell City and Lake City and Pomeroy and Manson. The story had spread the way stories spread in farm country, person to person, phone call to phone call, until everyone within 40 miles had heard the essential facts. J.D. dealer, $10,000 bet, old Allis-Chalmers. Saturday night, the undercard classes ran first. Stock class, modified class, super stock. Good pulls, reasonable distances, the crowd applauding at the right moments and reaching for popcorn in between. But the grandstand was only half listening. They were waiting. The unlimited class was announced at 8:40 p.m. 7 tractors entered, 4 John Deeres, Gary's 4850 plus 3 other dealers and farmers who'd entered their own machines, an IH 1486, a Case 2590, and Delbert's WD-45. The other 6 pulled first. The IH made 200 feet. Respectable. One of the John Deere entries hit 218 spun tires at the end, good pull. The Case made 227, the best of the undercard. 2 of the other Deeres in the 170 and 195 range. The IH had a chain break at 140 and was done. Then Gary climbed into the cab of the 4850. The crowd responded. Gary knew how to play a moment. He waved through the cab window, gave the thumbs up, revved the engine twice so the crowd could hear what 192 horsepower sounded like under load. He positioned the machine precisely. The hookman attached the chain, and Gary pushed the throttle to the stop. The 4850 exploded off the line. There's no other word for it. The rear tires, 20.8 by 38 duals, brand new hard rubber, threw a rooster tail of dirt 15 feet behind the machine as they bit into the track. The sled moved fast, faster than anything the crowd had seen that night. 50 feet in what felt like seconds, 100 feet. The sled was getting heavy now, the weight transfer mechanism pushing resistance onto the runners, but the 4850 had reserves. It kept moving. 150 feet. The engine note deepened. 175. The tires were starting to dig ruts, the dirt piling up behind the lugs as the machine fought for traction. Then at 183 feet it happened. The transmission shifted. Just a fraction, just a moment of interrupted power as the power shift logic responded to the engine load. It was barely perceptible, but at 183 feet on a progressive resistance sled, barely perceptible was enough. The tires spun. Not dramatically. Gary recovered quickly, worked the throttle, tried to find traction in the ruts his own tires had dug, but the moment was gone. The machine ground forward another 4 feet before the tires broke entirely loose, spinning in the holes they'd created. Gary eased off. 187 feet. A good pull, the best of the night by 40 feet. He climbed out of the cab to applause. He waved, pointed at the crowd, did the thing he always did when he won. He walked to the announcer's booth and shook hands with Rick Dalton, the pull announcer, who had worked the Calhoun County Fair for 15 years. 187 feet, Rick said into the microphone. Gary Prentiss on the John Deere 4850, a new county fair record. Folks, that's your mark to beat. Gary looked toward the staging area where Delbert's WD-45 was waiting. Your turn, he mouthed. Delbert drove the WD-45 onto the track at walking pace, 1.8 miles per hour, the machine's standard first-gear road speed. The crowd, which had been on its feet for the 4850, sat back down. Some people headed for the exit, their attention already moving toward the parking lot. The announcer did his best. And our final competitor of the evening, folks, Delbert Moes on a 1953 Allis-Chalmers WD-45. That is a vintage machine, ladies and gentlemen. Let's give Mr. Moes a hand for bringing some history to the Calhoun County pull. Applause. The polite, brief, half-distracted kind. Delbert positioned the WD-45 at the starting line. He took his time. He set the front wheels exactly square with the track, checked the position of the hitch relative to the sled chain, made a small adjustment. The hookman attached the chain. Delbert checked it himself before the hookman had moved away, tugging it once to confirm the connection. Then he set the throttle, not wide open, exactly 3/4. The position that put the engine at 1400 RPM, the position he'd found in his back field on 2 evenings in June, while a stopwatch and a notebook sat on the fender beside him. He released the clutch. The WD-45 moved forward. Not fast, not with the drama of the 4850, not with rooster tails or engines screaming or the crowd rising to its feet. Just forward. A steady, almost peaceful forward that didn't look like it was competing with anything. The chain went taut. The sled moved. 20 feet. 30. The crowd that had been heading for the exit stopped and turned. Not because anything dramatic was happening, because nothing dramatic was happening, and that was wrong. That was different from every other pull they'd seen. Every other machine had made noise and dust and theater. The WD-45 was making progress. 40 feet. 50. The tires were not spinning. That was the thing. Every eye in the grandstand had watched the 4850's tires throw dirt. The WD-45's tires were turning clean, each lug pressing into the track surface and pulling free without slipping. The calcium chloride weight had done exactly what Delbert calculated, pressed the tires through the dried crust and into the moist layer below, where the soil held. 60 feet. 70. The crowd noise changed. The ambient murmur of 2,400 people at a fair, which is a particular kind of sound, half conversation and half distraction, shifted into something else. Focus. The kind of collective attention that a crowd produces when it realizes it's watching something it didn't anticipate. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Gary Prentiss was standing 20 feet from the track, hands in his jacket pockets, watching. His expression had not changed. He was still wearing the salesman's composure, the steady, confident face, but his right hand in his pocket had closed into a fist. 80 feet. 90. The WD-45's engine note hadn't changed. Still the same steady rhythm at 1400 RPM, the governor doing its job, holding the speed constant as the load increased. This was the thing the horsepower chart didn't show. The WD-45's governor was designed for sustained field work, for holding a precise speed under varying load conditions, for keeping the engine in its efficiency band regardless of what was pulling against it. It was designed for exactly this. 100 feet. The grandstand was standing. Not everyone, not all at once, but the front rows first, and then the middle, and then the back, as the information traveled. That tractor is at 100 feet. That's past where the case stopped. That's past where 3 of the John Deeres stopped, and it's still moving. 120 feet. 140. The WD-45 was slowing. The sled resistance was punishing now. The progressive weight fully loaded, more than any machine in the class had faced at this distance. But Delbert had one more calculation in his favor: the gear ratio. In first gear, the WD-45's transmission multiplied the engine's torque by a factor of 11.4 before it reached the rear axle. The 4850, in the gear Gary had pulled in, had a ratio of 7.6. The difference was the reason a 43 horsepower engine could sustain meaningful drawbar force against a resistance that had already defeated a 992 horsepower machine. The math wasn't beautiful. It didn't produce a win, but it produced something that nobody in Calhoun County had thought was possible. 160 feet. 170. 180. The crowd was making a sound now that was not quite cheering, not quite silence, but something between, the sustained collective breath of people watching the boundary of their expectations get crossed foot by foot and not knowing yet how far it would go. 185 feet. 186. 187. Tied. Gary's jaw was tight. His hand in his pocket had opened, then closed again. 188 feet. The WD-45 crossed Gary's mark. 188 feet, and 2 inches to be exact. which was how the measurement was recorded in the Calhoun County Fair poll records that night. The crowd, all 2,400 of them, plus the 300 at the fence, erupted. Not a sports crowd eruption, not the roar of a touchdown, a farm country eruption, which is a different sound, sustained, deep, the kind of noise that comes from people who don't express things casually and mean it absolutely when they do. Delbert held the throttle steady for 3 more seconds. The engine was laboring, the tractor barely moving, inching forward against resistance that was now, by the pull sled's progressive mechanism, nearly its maximum. 189 feet. 190. At 190 feet and 6 inches, the tires found the bottom of their grip. Not spinning, the calcium chloride weight had pressed them deep enough that they dug rather than spun. They dug until they couldn't dig further. The machine stopped. Delbert pulled the throttle back to idle. He sat in the seat for a moment, the engine ticking over quietly, the crowd noise washing over the track like a wave. Then he shut the engine off, climbed down, and walked toward the announcer's booth. Not fast, the way he always walked. Steady, like a man with exactly the right amount of time. Gary Prentiss met him halfway. The crowd around the announcer's booth had gotten thick fast, farmers pushing in, wanting to be close, wanting to hear this next part. Rick Dalton had his microphone in hand and a look on his face like a man who understood that he was about to announce something people would remember for 30 years. Gary looked at Delbert. Delbert looked at Gary. 190 feet 6 inches, Delbert said. The bet was 1 foot. Gary said nothing for a moment. Around them the crowd was close enough to hear breathing. 200 people in the immediate area, another 2,000 watching from the grandstand. Gary had been many things in his career. Aggressive, sometimes arrogant, occasionally dishonest in the small, deniable ways that dealerships sometimes are. But he was not, in the deepest part of him, a man who went back on his word in front of witnesses. His father had told him once that a handshake in farm country was more binding than a contract, because a contract could be lawyered around, but a handshake in front of neighbors followed you for life. He'd made the handshake. 60 people had seen it on Friday. 2,400 people had seen the pull. Gary turned to Rick Dalton and nodded. Rick raised the microphone. Folks, the results of the unlimited class, Gary Prentiss on the John Deere 4850, 18.7 feet. Delbert Moes on the 1953 Allis-Chalmers WD-45, 190 feet 6 inches. Pause. Delbert Moes wins the Calhoun County Fair Unlimited class. The sound from the grandstand was something Rick Dalton talked about for the rest of his life. Then Rick read the second part, the part Gary had agreed to on Friday in the staging area. And per the terms of an agreement made public at this fair, Gary Prentiss of Prentiss Implement would like to announce that his $58,000 John Deere 4850 was outpulled tonight by a 1953 Allis-Chalmers WD-45 purchased for $600. The grandstand went up again. Gary stood at the microphone and said it himself, because a handshake in front of witnesses meant you said it yourself. Delbert beat me, he said. His voice was steady. Fair pull, fair result. He beat me. He reached into his jacket, took out a checkbook and wrote the check against the announcer's booth wall, $10,000. Made out to Delbert Moes. He handed it over. Delbert folded it without looking at it and put it in his shirt pocket. How? Gary said quietly. Just the one word. Delbert looked at him. You spent 15 years telling this county that new is better, Delbert said. Better horsepower, better technology, better everything. And some of that's true. Your 4850 is a remarkable machine. He looked out at the track where the WD-45 sat at 190 feet, the orange paint faded and the seat worn and the hour meter at 9,261. But you never asked what the old machines were doing right. You only counted what they weren't doing. You saw 43 horsepower and stopped looking. You never looked at the gear ratio. You never looked at the torque curve. You never looked at what happens at the tire-to-ground contact when the surface has a dried crust on top of moist soil. He paused. You never asked me what I knew about my own tractor. And that's your problem, Gary. You don't ask, you tell. Gary was quiet. I came in here twice, Delbert said. 1975, 1978. You showed me brochures. You told me what I needed. You never asked what I had. He turned and walked back toward his tractor. The crowd parted for him. The Monday morning after the pull, Gary Prentiss opened his showroom at 8 o'clock as usual. By 8:30 he had 3 customers. By noon he'd had 9. Not unusual for a Monday after the fair, but the conversations were different. Every one of them started the same way. So, Gary, 190 feet. Not hostile, not angry, just the question hanging in the air, quiet and heavy as August heat. The question that contained the other question, the one nobody said out loud. If a $600 tractor can do that, what exactly am I paying $58,000 for? Gary answered each one. He explained gear ratios, which was honest. He explained tire weighting, which was accurate. He explained that Delbert had spent months preparing a purpose-built pull configuration, which was also true. All of it was true. All of it was incomplete. Because the story that farmers were telling each other in the following weeks wasn't about gear ratios or tire weighting. The story was simpler than that. The story was that Delbert Moes, who had farmed 240 acres for 30 years with careful hands and patient attention, understood his tractor well enough to make it do something it wasn't supposed to be able to do. And that Gary Prentiss, who had sold equipment in this county for 19 years and talked louder than anyone about which machine was better, had never taken the time to understand what Delbert had. That was the story. And the story changed things. Not immediately. Not in a way that showed up in quarterly sales reports, but in the slow, ground-level way that things change in farm country. In the conversations at the parts counter and the co-op and the elevator, in the way farmers started looking at their existing equipment differently, in the way they started asking different questions when they did come into the showroom. Not what's the horsepower on that 4850, but what's the drawbar pull in low gear, and what's the torque curve, and how does the transmission handle sustained load? Questions that Gary had to actually answer instead of sidestep. He answered them. Gary was many things, but he was not stupid. He hired a technical specialist from the Deere regional office, a young engineer named Marcus Webb, who could speak to gear ratios and torque curves and tire contact physics. He retrained his sales staff to talk about the whole machine, not just the headline numbers. He stopped making the bet-style speeches at the co-op. It cost him something. The bravado had been part of his identity, and identity is hard to change. But the pull had cost him something more. It had cost him the assumption of unquestionable authority. And without that assumption, the bravado would have just looked hollow. Delbert deposited the $10,000 check on Monday morning. He used $1,200 to have the WD-45's engine overhauled at Hugo Bauer's shop in Humboldt, not because it needed it, but because Delbert believed in maintenance, and an engine that had run 9,261 hours deserved a careful look at the valve seats and the bearing clearances. Hugo found both excellent. He replaced 2 injector tips and the governor spring. The engine came back running cleaner than before. He put the remaining $8,800 in a savings account and drew on it when his property tax bill came due the following spring. He never talked about the pull. People asked him about it, at the elevator, in the hardware store, and the lumberyard, and Delbert always said the same thing. Good pull track that night. Conditions were right. That was all he ever said. In the years that followed, the pull at the 1981 Calhoun County Fair became a kind of measuring stick in that part of Iowa. Not for tractors, for ideas. For the idea that the number on the brochure isn't the whole story. For the idea that understanding a tool, really understanding it down to the gear ratios and the tire pressures and the torque curve, is worth more than a bigger engine. Farmers who'd been there, and more who claimed to have been there, as is always the case with legendary events, told the story at farm sales and retirement dinners and county extension meetings. The details shifted slightly in the telling, the way details always do. The bet was sometimes $15,000, sometimes $20,000. The distance margin was sometimes 10 feet, sometimes 20, but the core never changed. Old tractor, new tractor, one man who understood his machine, one man who understood his brand. The man who understood his machine won. Gary Prentiss kept his dealership open through the difficult years of the mid-1980s farm crisis, when tractor sales collapsed across the state and dealers who'd overextended closed their doors. He survived by focusing on parts and service, the unglamorous work that kept farmers' existing machines running instead of selling them new ones. It was, he later said in a Farm Bureau interview, the most educational period of his career. I learned what tractors actually do, he said, instead of what they say they do on the brochure. He retired in 1994 and sold the dealership to his son-in-law. Before he left, he did something unusual. He drove to Delbert Moes's farm, the first time he'd been there in the 20 years he'd known Delbert. Delbert was in the machine shed, doing what he always did, working on something, in this case replacing the hydraulic seal on the WD-45's rock shaft housing. Gary watched him work for a minute. "You knew, didn't you?" Gary said. "Before the bet, you already knew you could beat me." Delbert tightened the last bolt on the seal housing, wiped his hands on a rag, and looked at Gary. "I knew the machine could beat yours. I didn't know if the track conditions would be right. But you'd calculated it." "I'd calculated it." "For how long?" "About 3 years." Gary was quiet. He looked at the WD-45. It was 31 years old now. The hour meter read 11,400. The paint was faded in places to bare metal. The seat had been recovered once with a piece of vinyl that didn't quite match the original. But the engine idled with a smoothness that new machines sometimes didn't have, the particular smoothness of a mechanism that has worn into itself over thousands of hours and found its own equilibrium. "What made you enter?" Gary asked. "After all those years, what made you enter in 1981? Delbert set the wrench on the workbench. "You came into my place twice," he said, 1975 and 78, showed me brochures, told me what I was missing, told me what my tractor couldn't do." He looked at Gary. "Nobody had asked me what it could do." Gary nodded slowly. "The $10,000 was yours to lose," Delbert said. "I was just the one who proved it." Gary shook his hand and drove home. He thought about that conversation for a long time. Delbert Moes farmed his 240 acres until 2001, when he was 81 years old, and his knees decided that climbing on and off a tractor without a cab and a step assist was a younger man's activity. He sold the farm to his nephew, a man named Curtis Moes, who had grown up watching Delbert work and had his uncle's patience, if not quite his precision. Curtis still farms it. He has a modern tractor now. A used Case IH from 2007 with 4,900 hours on it, bought at a reasonable price, maintained religiously. The WD-45 is in the machine shed. Curtis keeps it running. He fires it up every spring and runs it around the yard, listening to the engine, checking the governor response, making sure everything that should move moves and everything that should be tight is tight. He changes the oil. He greases the fittings. He keeps the tires inflated to the exact pressure his uncle wrote on a piece of masking tape stuck to the fender back in 1978. He hasn't pulled it at the fair, but people know it's there. Farmers who were at the pull in 1981 mention it to their children and grandchildren. That machine in Curtis Moes's shed, that's the one. That orange WD-45, that's the one that pulled 190 feet against a $58,000 John Deere. The hour meter reads 11,847. It has not been rebuilt. It does not need to be. Sometimes the most powerful machine in the field isn't the one with the biggest engine. Sometimes it's the one whose owner spent 3 years understanding the gear ratios, the torque curve, and the condition of the pull track on a hot July evening. Sometimes $600 and 30 years of careful maintenance beats $58,000 and 19 years of brochures. Gary Prentiss bet $10,000 that new always beats old. Delbert Moes knew that understanding always beats assuming. The WD-45 pulled 190 feet and 6 inches. The grandstand was on its feet, and somewhere in the machine shed on a 240-acre farm in northeast Calhoun County, an orange tractor sits in the dark, its hour meter at 11,847, its governor spring tight, its valve seats clean, waiting for the next time someone needs to know what it can do. It knows what it can do. It always did. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.